Shalom, shalom, friends. It is wonderful to have you here with us, wherever you are in the world, on the live stream or on the recording. We are so happy to have you here with us today to learn about the social justice vision of Sefer Devarim, of the book of Deuteronomy, with a teacher of mine, Rabbi Nati Helfgot, Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgot, who is the chair of the Department of Talmud and Rabbinics at SAR High School, and is the spiritual leader of Congregation Nativot Shalom in Teaneck, New Jersey. Wonderful shul. I was just there recently. Try to visit at least once a year. He's a member of YCT's faculty in the Department of Bible and Jewish Thought, the Smicha program I went to, and is the convener of the department's Yemei Iyun, the Days of Learning, for the community. Rabbi Helfgot was previously director of the Judaic Studies curriculum at Mayanot Yeshiva High School for Girls. He's the author of Divrei Bracha Umoed, halachic essays on the topics of holidays and blessings, and the editor of Community, Covenant, and Commitment, Selected Letters and Communications of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, and the YCT companion to the Book of Samuel. In addition, he has served as editors of several journals. You can also find his regular op-eds he's writing and classes he's giving in many different capacities. Sefer Devarim is a wonderfully rich book and incredibly unique in the Torah, and not only unique in terms of the voice and the tone and style, but in terms of some of the unique values that get emphasized, relevant to our Orthodox social justice movement, a Torah-rooted movement to address suffering and to alleviate the plight of the vulnerable. So, Rav Nati, it is a delight to have you here with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Rav Shmuley. Thank you so much, and kol hakavod on all the work that you and your colleagues have been doing for years. How old is Uri Litzedek these days?
2007. So it's 17 years now. They're in the YCT Beit Midrash, right next to you. I came out and we talked about the naming of Uri Litzedek.
I think it's beautiful, and they've done tremendous work in very positive ways in terms of social justice in the world, an Orthodox social justice movement. And it's kol hakavod, and to your credit and to the credit of all those who work with you and support you on these matters, and organizations that parallel you in Israel that you've partnered with and imitated. Flattery is imitation is the greatest form of flattery, and they've imitated you in certain things. So kol hakavod, and keep up the good work. So Rav Shmuley and Isaac, they invited me to share some thoughts on. They asked me if I would teach some Torah during the summer when I'm a little bit more free on some social justice topics. So I thought we just began the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Devarim. I'm going to try to translate everything I say. I may not be as successful as I can. So anybody wants to ask any questions along the way, please put them in the chat, or you want to ask them directly, that's fine as well. So I wanted to speak today and make a couple of points about the topic of social justice in the book of Deuteronomy. First of all, just as Rav Shmuley hinted at, the book of Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Torah. It's a little bit different than the other books of the Torah, specifically as opposed to the other four books of the Torah, which are presented much more in the style of third person, where we are recording the narratives. We see things as they happen. They're legal material. The book of Devarim is a series of speeches. It's a series of historical, political, religious, theological speeches Moses gave in the last month that he was alive on this earth. And it's very much in the voice of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, our teacher. And that often affects some of the differences that we find between the book of Deuteronomy and the other books of the Torah, that it relates to Moses as, in those final month of his life, but specifically it relates that he's going to emphasize things that are relevant to a nation that's about to enter the land, and to be responsible, to be a polity, not a group just of a ragtag bunch of people in a desert that emerged from slavery, but now they're going to be a nation in a country with a justice system, with responsibility to set up an entire system of governance, a system of economy, a system that deals with land distribution, the system, it's going to be much more, there's much more responsibility on the human level than living in the desert and getting the man from heaven and, living a very angelic, almost, miraculous lifestyle. You have to take responsibility. You have to take responsibility for the nation, for choices, for making sure that there is justice and there is adjudication, etc., in the land. In fact, some of the great Hasidic masters, they often note that the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, is kind of the first Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's Moses playing the role, not simply of lawgiver, simply being a tape recorder. I don't know, I guess, what will we... There used to be a thing called a tape recorder. I don't know. What do we do? What do we call it today? An MP3. Not simply being a tape recorder and transmitting what God said, but actually giving his inflection of interpretation to what God said and presenting it to a people that is now about to enter the land, conquer the land, have an army, take responsibility for military decisions, political decisions. And it's very much a kind of Torah Sheba'al Peh, where human beings get involved in interpreting the Torah, in nuancing the Torah, in transmitting the Torah with the specific context that they are confronting. So that's a first point. The second point is, given that, we're going to find the book of Devarim has many important themes that are relevant to the historical context of entering the land. So there's a tremendous emphasis on a very heightened monotheism. Monotheism becomes very central in the book of Devarim, and it's a very heightened monotheism, transcendence of God. You didn't see last week's parsha, we read, you didn't see any vision. You didn't see any tmuna, any picture of God. The only thing you heard was a voice. The movement from visual to orality. Your experience of God was totally oral. To move away from any manifestation of representing the deity by something that you see. The distance between the world that we experience, the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, the fish, the behemoth, the animals, and God, who's totally other from the world, becomes very central. So we have a rejection of idolatry. We have the centralization of worship in Jerusalem, becomes a major theme in this book. The theme of the love of God becomes a very major theme in this book. V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, the Shema portion, becomes central in this book. And the notion of creating the brit and the covenant with God is very, very central. And in the context of love of God and keeping his commandments, the idea of imitating God becomes very central in this book, which will connect later to what we're talking about in terms of social justice. Because after all these other themes, we also have very much highlighted interwoven into all these other themes about the centralization of the cult, about loving God, about imitating God. We have a tremendous amount of mitzvot that we would call social justice mitzvot, mitzvot that try to help the poor, try to uplift those who are suffering, who try to make the world better, what today is called tikkun olam in some ways. But it's always interwoven with the religious vision of the book of Deuteronomy. So I want to say a couple of general things, and then I want to try to show them, and then I want to focus on one or two chapters in the book of Devarim specifically, and then leave open time for questions. So I want to say a couple of very broad themes that in terms of just organizing the material in our head and thinking about the biblical notions, bigadol, in broad strokes that are highlighted in the book of Deuteronomy, and then try to, highlight them and show them. So if we think about the Torah broadly, and especially the book of Devarim, in comparison to the world in which it was given and the surrounding world in which Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, were going to enter the land of Israel, first and foremost, one of the most interesting factors is if you compare much of the ancient Near Eastern world, the notion that you're supposed to do this for the person, for the poor person, or that, or you make a decree, it all in the ancient Near Eastern world often came from the king. The king would decide, okay, I just got coronated. Okay, everybody should get, his fields allowed to be returned. Or the king, just won a great battle. Okay, I'm going to give a tax cut. Remember in the story in the Megillat Esther, much later, where he gives a tax cut to everybody because he got married, etc., and positive things happen. The Bible is unique in much of the ancient Near Eastern literature in that it integrates whatever we call the laws of social justice, the laws of tzedakah, the laws of shemitah, of the sabbatical year, the laws into chok, into law. It's not at the whim of the pontate. It's not at the potentate. It's not at the whim of the king or of the political power structure to decide. It is something that is kavua, set in motion in law, that is established and is always there. Chok in the biblical term means something that comes from year to year, something that's always going to happen. It's not capricious. It's not something that's left up to chance and left up to, you have a good king, you have a bad king, you have a nice king, you have a bad, you have a good ruler, you have a bad ruler. It's established into the very essence of the brit, of the covenant and the law. Number two, and this is important because it's different because we are so, we live in a world of nation states and we so much focus on the nation state. And that's part of our political debates here in this country. We're in the middle of a very polarized political situation. Very much the question of how much should the state, the government do versus individuals and society. Certainly, when you look at the Bible, and even in Chazal, in the rabbis later, the focus on what we would call social justice is very much on the individual and the society, or what we might call today civil society, rather than the state. You don't find in the book of Devarim, you don't find that, again, the state, whatever state is set up, is the one that is going to, go and, redistribute wealth or things of that nature that we might talk about today. Yes, the state has to set up a system in which there is justice and people aren't taken advantage of and things like that. But it's much more preventative rather than the laws of tzedakah, what we might call welfare or things of that nature, they're not generated from the state. They're generated from the individual or the chevrati, the society or the civil society. Number three, the third important element that you find in biblical notions of what we would call social justice is that it has two dimensions when we talk about dealing with the poor. Number one, it talks about kiyum he'ani, to make sure that the poor person or the person suffering is sustained, that he lives at a basic level of dignity. That's one level of many of the mitzvot. The second level of mitzvot is the ultimate goal is shikum, as we say in Hebrew, shikum he'ani, which means to reestablish the poor person to a place where they can be on their own. The idea is not that they should ultimately always be poor and that they should be on subsistence forever and ever. There is a goal to hopefully reestablish them and give them a chance, a second chance to start again and be on their own feet. So there's two levels of mitzvot that we talk about. Number 4, it's fascinating that, and this touches on an interesting issue that became a very interesting debate in the 1990s in the United States. Tonight at the Democratic National Convention, Bill and Hillary Clinton are going to show up. So Bill Clinton is very famous in the 1990s, where he put into legislation the concept of going from welfare to workfare. The idea that people who are on public subsistence shouldn't simply get the money, but that they should have to work a certain amount or show their attempt to get work, to get jobs, to do things, and not simply be on subsistence, unless they're literally dying or they're in some way disabled that they can't in any way, get a job. And this became a big issue in terms of, so the same thing here in the Torah also. The Torah also seems to assume, at least on some level, that the person receiving help is supposed to do something. From the small thing, like we have a mitzvah in the Torah called leket, shikha, and peah, that you have to, that a person who owns a farm, and it was an agrarian society, has to leave over a corner of the field and have, and allow people to come and take from that corner of the field, or that which falls on the ground, the shikha and the leket, they have to let people come in and take that and not go back a second time and collect, the sheaves, the gleanings, as we find in the story of the book of Ruth. Or even the concept of a loan. The concept of a loan, assumes that I'm giving you money to do something with it, that you're going to invest, that you're going to pay off debts, that you're going to buy a house, that you're going to do something with the money. It's not simply. So there's a kind of assumption in the Torah that the person getting it, I don't just drop the leket in front of his house with a nice little box and bow, that he also, or she, is supposed to go out into the field and be involved in collecting this. That person has to do some sort of ma'amat, some sort of action. The person receives a loan, they're supposed to do something, hopefully, to be able to reestablish themselves on their feet. Number 5, in this context, the Bible, as we all know, or many of us know, right? The Torah is not, it's not Marx, it's not Marxist, and it's not Keynesian, it's not Milton Friedman or this one, it's the Torah. The Torah has its own perspective on economics. But one thing is, the Torah does not assume that, or does it see it as a goal, that somehow private property should be abolished. Torah never says anything that private property should be abolished. This kind of, socialist utopia, that the Torah doesn't assume that at all. The Torah also does not assume that one of the goals of the mitzvot is to create a society where everybody, each according to his means and each according to his work. No, the Torah never talks about that. The erech, so to speak, the ultimate goal of the Torah is not shivyon, to use the Hebrew word, is not equality, that everybody should earn the same. Okay, the Torah recognizes that there's going to be poor people, rich people, middle class people, etc., and it assumes that there's going to be a private property, free enterprise, etc. But it assumes that it's not a kind of laissez-faire capitalism where, survival of the fittest, and people who didn't do well in the market are supposed to just, suck it up and take it, but rather that there has to be checks and balances, to make sure that nobody is left behind, and there is not such egregious differences of wealth that people suffer great poverty and are not able to provide for themselves and their families. So I think these are the kind of broad principles of social justice that emerge if you just read the Torah, in terms of how we are supposed to, our attitude to people who are in difficult situations and suffering, and especially economically. And instead of the concept of shivyon, the concept of equality, the concept that drives, and especially in the book of Devarim, the concept that drives the social justice vision of the Torah is a different word, and that's the word achva. Achva, which comes from the word achim, from the word a brother, family, your responsibility to family. Now, family, we all understand, is writ small, but it's also writ large, concentric circles of responsibility to the family. And you can have the family of your immediate family. You have the family of those who share your historical, your past, present, and future. And so we talk about achicha over and over again. Now, there are other things where we also expand even beyond that, where we talk in the book of Devarim about the ger, about the, and then literally on a pshat level in the book of Devarim, it's not talking about a convert, a righteous convert. It's talking about a foreigner who is living amongst the Israelite society in Israel. There is that broader responsibility because of the ger who's come to share with you, and he is part of your society. He may not have the same level of closeness, of achva, that your literal family and your spiritual family that shares the same vision of covenantal responsibility has, but he also participates in a level of achva as being part of the human race, being created in the image of God, sharing space with you on this earth, and not being, God forbid, an enemy, but being a loyal citizen of the country that you've created. So that person is the ger, is also included. So it's not about equality. It's not about shivyon. The social justice vision of the Torah is much more about the concept of achva, of achva. And in this context, again, these are kind of important principles that we have to lay down, I think, before we get into some of the nitty gritty. Okay, that's introduction number one. Introduction number two, or ideas. I hope, again, please feel free to ask any questions, any comments that I think are relevant. In the context of the laws of what we would call social justice, two key words appear throughout the Bible. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, has pointed out that they appear the most in the book of Devarim, and that's the word tzedakah or tzedek. The root of tzedakah and tzedek, righteousness, justice, and righteousness appear most. They appear in two books. It's almost like there's a bookend. It's like almost a chiastic structure, A, B, B, A. They appear 16 times in the book of Genesis, 18 times in the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, 5 times in the book of Leviticus, which is about holiness, and 4 times in the book of Exodus, and no times in the book of Numbers, in the book of Devarim. So kind of the Torah is enveloped in tzedek on one side and one side. And specifically, when we talk about, tzedek and the shoresh of tzedakah, right? It's a mistranslation to translate it as charity, and to translate charity, tzedakah as charity is a mistranslation. It's a Christian interpretation. The word charity comes from the Latin word caritas, which means, of course, love and mercy. Anybody that knows Spanish Cariño means, oh, beloved, and caritas is based on the notion of Christian love. I don't really have an obligation to you, but I love you. I have mercy on you. I have grace. And therefore, because of grace, I give you. Tzedakah is not grace. Tzedakah is an obligatory. It's righteousness, doing the right thing. It's actually giving something because you have to do it. It's a chiyuv. It's an obligation. So the laws of social justice in the Torah, they're not a nice thing. It's not out of the goodness of your heart, grace. It's not chesed in that classical sense. It's not caritas, but it's tzedakah. Even to the extent that in later halacha, you'll find an interesting concept of kofin. You even do kefiyah. Kefiyah literally means coercion. That if you live long enough in a city, you are coerced by the local townspeople to give a certain amount. If they decide that in order to run the soup kitchen, everybody who lives in the town has to pony up every week $10, they can garnish your wages and get you to do that, because it's not caritas, it's not a voluntary contribution, it's an obligation that once you're there in part of the society. Okay, let's go further. If we had to divide the categories of tzedakah, of social justice, bigadol in broad terms. So we have basically three big categories. Number one are the categories of mitzvot that try to ensure the dignity of human beings and life. Things like disposing of a corpse properly, things like not returning a fugitive slave to his or her owner, which all appear in the book of Deuteronomy. These are all things about reflecting that every person is created in the image of God and that every person has the right to dignity, and we don't defile a corpse. Even a capital criminal has to be taken down from the tree and buried properly. The second one is what we would, call helping the weak in society, giving charity, loans, canceling debts, Shemitah, the laws of Shemitah, the laws of Yovel, of the Jubilee year, and of course, the third broad category are things that have to do with showing our humane treatment to all of God's creations, animals, trees, in war, things of that nature, which are also part of this vision. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that, social justice, part of it is this idea is wedded to the notion of the fact that it's interspersed in the book of Devarim and in all the books of the Torah, but especially in the book of Devarim, with the notion of God, the transcendent God of Israel. And it's not social justice as, in opposition to the religious moment, but it's fully integrated into the religious moment. To take one example, and let me see if I can share, I'll start with that. To take one example from the book of Deuteronomy. So if we look at, people see that on the screen? Yeah. Okay. So if we look at chapter, just to show you something, right? So if we go back, just take something which at first blush has nothing to do at first blush with social justice the way we normally think about it. The mitzvah of Shabbat. The mitzvah of Shabbat, the concept of Shabbat. So if we looked, for example, we went back for a second and looked at Shabbat as it's presented in the book of Exodus, in the 5 books of Moses. So if we look in chapter 20 of the book of Exodus, so when the Torah presents Shabbat, Zachor Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, Shesh Yamim Ta'avod V'Asita Kol Melachtecha, Yom HaShvi Shabbat L'Adonai Elohecha, etc., etc. Why should you keep the Shabbos? Everybody in your family, including the non-Jew, the stranger who lives within your gates. So we imitate God, just as God rested on the Sabbath. We are supposed to imitate God on the Sabbath. Okay. When you get to the book of Devarim, however, when you get to the book of Devarim, and you look at the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 commandments, 10 statements, when they're repeated, you have a very different presentation of the Sabbath. Keep the Sabbath as I commanded you. Also your animals. Interesting, the animals are added here. They're not there before. You're going into the land. You're going to also work your animals, something that you didn't do in the desert when you relied on the manna. But here there's a responsibility of your animals resting. The purpose of the Sabbath is that they rest. Ki eved ayita beretz Mitzrayim, vayotziacha Hashem Elokecha misham, biyad chazaka v'yizra'on netuya, al kein tzivcha Hashem Elokecha lasot et yom HaShabbat. So here, why do you remember the Sabbath? I'm not imitating the God who rested in creation. I'm imitating the God who is mishachrer avadim. How do you imitate God, right? You can't imitate God by making a picture of the sun. You can't imitate God by making a representation of God. How do you imitate God in the Jewish notion? You imitate God by remembering, just as God freed you from bondage, once a week you free everybody in your society, in your immediate family from bondage. V'zacharta, right? It says, the purpose is just as you have to engage in self freedom, in releasing yourself from the imposed bondage, you have to imitate God and free somebody else, free the people who are your quote-unquote slaves and workers. You are imitating God HaMishachrer, the God who is Mishachrer. So the social justice theme of imitating God, who is the God who frees the slaves and lets them rest, is inherent in the way Shabbat is presented in the book of Devarim, even before we get to the specific, what we would call social justice mitzvot. So that's like just one example. When we get to, now I'd like to turn, when we get to later on in the book of Deuteronomy, when we get to the book of Deuteronomy, so there, the first 5 chapters, I'm sorry, the chapter 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 are all chapters that deal with the broad themes of the covenant. Love God, fear God, remember the Exodus, remember Sinai, remember that you did the sin of the golden calf, all those kind of broad themes. From chapter 12 on, we have the specific mitzvot where we're supposed to, so to speak, put into practice. And it starts with, again, it's almost like a header, a new header. The book of Devarim began, Eila HaDvarim, and the book, and the Aseret HaDibrot began with, these are the words that God spoke. And now God, Eila HaChukim VaMishpatim, these are the Chukim VaMishpatim. And it talks about centralization of the cult. But what's interesting is this is really the only place, very little discussion in the book of Devarim about the korbanot. Very little about the korbanot. It says that you have to centralize the worship in the place that God will choose to have his name dwell there, but it doesn't have the repetition. That's why it's a misnomer to call Devarim a repetition of the Torah, because it doesn't repeat the entire book of Vayikra, for example. We don't have, there's very little repetition of much of the first half of the laws of Vayikra. It has some of it, but not most of it. And again, it focuses away from the korbanot, not because the korbanot somehow are unimportant. They are a vehicle of religious connection to God, but the Moshe Rabbeinu chose to focus on other things as he's giving his last speech. And in the context of mentioning the korbanot that you're going to bring to the place which God has chosen, he says, "Ve'veitem sham olotechem v'zivchechem ve'masrotechem." You're going to bring all these korbanot, which are, notice the focus is very much on the what we would call the voluntary korbanot. It doesn't talk about the chatat, doesn't talk about the sin offering. It talks about the nidavot, the nidaret, and the truma, and all the things that you have to bring. V'achaltem sham, you should eat there and be happy. And then it concludes, you're going to bring all this thing. Usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem atem uvenechem v'notechem v'avdechem v'amhotechem, your servants and your maidservants, v'halevi asher b'sha'arechem ki ein lo chelik v'nachala itchem. He is not able to come and offer these things because he doesn't have land. The Levites had no land, which means they were totally they totally subsisted on the nidarim and the ma'asrot, on the tithes. And so you have to make sure that that person is included. So in the very moment where it talks about coming to God's place and only to God's place, it makes sure that part of the simcha of Hashem, part of the simcha has to be, which is a kind of quintessential experience, simcha, the great joy of serving God in the temple, has to include people who could be left out. This theme of when you do what we would call purely religious acts, there has to be an element of social justice involved in it, also shows up later on. In another example, in the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of chapter 16, where the Bible talks about the holidays, which here too, the holidays are going to be done in the temple. And in that context, the Bible once again introduces, you're going to have Pesach, then you're going to have Shavuot. V'samachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, ata uvincha uvitecha, v'avdecha v'matcha, v'halevi asher b'she'arecha, v'hager v'hayatom v'almana, and the stranger and the orphan and the widow. B'makom asher yivchar Hashem Elokecha l'shakein shmo sham. When you come to God's house, the only way that there is full simcha is if you are inclusive of the people who have the least in society. Your religious experience has to be bounded together with taking care of the weakest, because that's what God did. God is a God who took care of the weak. God is the God. And again, so it's not just, we all know, many of us know, that the Bible talks about the fact that you're not allowed to oppress the ger. You're not allowed to oppress the strangers. 36 times in the Bible it says that. And it often says, and you should remember how you were once a ger in Egypt. So it's not just the negative, oh, don't oppress the ger. Don't be nasty to them. Fine. In addition, what's less emphasized is that in the positive religious experiences that don't seem to do anything with social justice, you have to make sure that you're imitating God fully. And to imitate God is to include the Levi, the Yatom, the Ger, Asher B'kirbecha. And it's repeated again with Sukkot, that you have to samachta b'chagecha, ata uvincha uvitecha v'avdecha v'amatcha v'alevi v'ager v'yatom v'almana asher b'she'arecha. This, of course, becomes
the source for the famous statement of Maimonides. Let me just bring it up here, if I can bring it up. Maimonides transposes this to the laws of holidays in our day and age. So I'm sorry, Maimonides, Hilchot Moadim. So Maimonides, where is it? Hilchot Yom Tov. It's called Hilchot Yom Tov. In chapter 7, Hilchot Yom Tov. Well, let's just see if I can just find Mishnah Torah. Let's see if we can find it easily. Yeah, use the Chabad. That's easiest. So in the laws of Yom Tov, if I'm not mistaken, in chapter 7, the Rambam says this. Was it chapter 6? Maimonides. Pam, 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 pam. Let me see. Yeah. Yeah. So Maimonides, let me see if I can get back my Zoom and share. Where's my more share? So Maimonides, in this context, has this very beautiful statement about how you're supposed to experience the holidays. You shouldn't go too far and drink too much wine and levity, but it should be before God. And then Maimonides says, where is it before? Maimonides says, yeah. And he talks about, how do you fulfill the mitzvah of Simchat Yom Tov? And he says you should give the kids little treats. And in his society, you buy your wives beautiful things. And then he says, so it's not only in the temple, but also in Fustat, in Cairo, in the 12th century, and in Teaneck, in the 21st century, and in Arizona, in the 21st century. You have to make sure that you include at your Shabbat meals and Yom Tov meals the ger, the yatom, amana. But if you close the houses of your gates, the gates of your houses, just your family, and you don't feed the poor and those who are poor of soul. It's a very important term. You can have a lot of money, but be in deep alienation, depression, be in a very difficult place in life. Ein zo simchat mitzvah ela simchat kreso. Someone who only takes care of their family and doesn't invite others. And others here doesn't mean the person that you went to high school, college, graduate school, and lived next to 30 years, and your kids went to school together and played baseball with, and have them over for a Shabbat meal. That's not achnasat orchim. That's just having your friends over. But we're talking about people who you don't necessarily know, but to expand the circle of achva. So that's a famous Rambam, which is expanding on the notion that the Bible has here in terms of that. Now, if we go back to the Deuteronomy, and now let me share that as well and go back to the last part. So if we share, so we go back to Deuteronomy and so the quintessential chapters of what we might call the explicit, right? I tried to show that even in the less explicit places, the book of Deuteronomy tries to make sure that our social consciousness about those who are less fortunate or in a difficult position have to be integrated into our religious consciousness, because that's what it means to imitate God. God wants us to act in this way, in the way that we treat our family, our extended family, our circles of responsibility, of achva, of brotherliness. The most explicit, of course, examples of this, then when we talk about the explicit examples, revolve around what we call Shemitah, the laws of Shemitah. In the rest of the Bible, Shemitah, Yovel, and Tzedakah. In the rest of the Bible, Shemitah is only related to land, that the land will rest because God rested. We're supposed to remember the Sabbath. We're supposed to remember that God is the author of all, and God, we don't really, right? Even though we are allowed to control land, God is the ultimate master of all. But in the book of Devarim, there's a new element introduced, and that is not only that we stop working in the Shemitah year on the land, but also that we cancel the debts, because in addition to the element of simply recognizing God's mastery, there's also an element of social justice that we have to make sure. Mikei sheva shanim taseh shmitah, v'zeh dvar shmitah shamot kol b'mashei yado asher yasher b're'ehu, lo yigosh et re'ehu ve'et achiv, ki kara shmitah la'Hashem. Again, so there's this notion of canceling debts. The foreigner, you don't have to cancel debts, because on a purely economic level, the notion that I should cancel a debt is crazy. Why should I cancel a debt? I gave money to somebody and I lost the opportunity to put it in the stock market. I lost the opportunity to build a business. I gave you $10,000. What does it mean I should cancel my debt? I did you a toiva. And what does it mean I shouldn't collect interest? I shouldn't in the normal course of events, there's absolutely nothing wrong with charging something. But it's not something that you do to your brother. It's not something that you do to your friend, to the person who's closest in your circles. So for them, we go out of our way and we do a special mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of canceling debts. And the goal of canceling debts is this aspirational goal that when you cancel the debt, the person has a chance, hopefully, to get out from under all those debts and start again and build his business, set up his credit, make a living, not have to maybe even save some money again, and not simply have to. So the idea is very clear in terms of that. In addition, the Torah in this context also adds what we today call the mitzvah of tzedakah. Again, the word achecha. Don't close your heart and don't close your hand. You should lend him what he needs. Again, the original context of tzedakah was lending. The idea being to try to get him back on his feet. And it's in the context of lending this money that you have to make sure that you have to, don't think that, the Shemitah year is going to come and cancel my debt. No. You have to give him with a full heart, because that's what God wants us to help. And the same thing about letting a Hebrew slave go. To allow him to start again, you give him a money in order, because you remember that you were in Egypt and you were freed just as God freed you. So what we looked at today in the book of Devarim, we looked at some of the broader themes of social justice, the 5 or 6 categories broadly of what social justice is reflected in the Torah as opposed to ancient Near Eastern society. We looked at the categories, the broad categories of social justice. We highlighted that the book of Devarim uses the word tzedek more than any other book in the 5 books of Moses. We highlighted that even in the religious mitzvot that don't seem to have anything to do with social justice, the book of Devarim adds a dimension that part of trying to connect to God, part of trying to connect to do the religious act is to include those who are in a more difficult situation, because that is how we imitate God. We engage in religious pursuits through including everyone in that attempt to be free, attempt to rest, attempt to connect to God. We have to include everybody. And then just finished off with some of the most explicit mitzvot, which are about, and before they talks about Yovel, which are all about the Jubilee year, which are all about the land returns to somebody else. The ideal is to try to allow someone to get back on their feet. As I mentioned, social justice has two components. One is to sustain the person so that they don't die, so that they're able to live even at a minimal subsistence. And number two, the ultimate goal is to establish them, reestablish them, let them stand on their own 2 feet so they're able to make a life for themselves again. So these are kind of the broad outlines of the book of Deuteronomy. And I have a few minutes. Anybody had any questions they wanted to ask? Things that were
beautiful.
Things that were unclear, things that were not, try to be as clear in general as possible.
Okay, beautiful. Shreya. Yeah. So the first question here. So, today, American politics, you may have heard, it's slightly polarizing, and people use Torah to defend their agendas, of course. And those on the right will say, I reject the whole language of social justice. It's the language of commies. You're all communists. The rich have the right to be as rich as they want. Taxation is theft. How would you push back on that? And those on the left, there are those on the left who basically want to say Sefer Devarim is equivalent with progressive economic justice agenda, whatever the case is. How would you push back up against that? And in the clash of that, how would you apply what you think is the essence of the ethos of Devarim to kind of today's contemporary, conversations of economic policy?
Right. So again, I think that, like I said before, I don't think the Torah has specific policy recommendations in a different situation where we have the welfare state and we're not an agrarian society. But the values are very clear. And the values are, number one, that whatever success people have, it's not unfettered. The Torah does not look askance at people being wealthy. There's nothing wrong with people being wealthy. This kind of, class revolt and all that stuff that everyone should equally make the same amount, I think is not a Torah value. As I said before, I think the idea of shivyon, that everybody is supposed to earn the exact same amount of money, is not a Torah value. On the other hand, it's also very clear that the idea that everything is just kind of, social Darwinism, that, whatever the market spits out, that's just let the market spit out. And if you're not good enough to play, too bad, and we don't have responsibility for you. That's certainly not something that the Torah would abide. And the idea that we should slash all social programs and not care about the people who aren't successful is not a Torah value. So in terms of values, the idea is, number one, there has to be I don't think that there should be this notion that you can't earn. Somebody wants to be a billionaire. There's nothing wrong with being a billionaire. Nothing wrong with being a billionaire. As long as you earn it honestly, you pay your taxes, you do tzedakah, you do all the things. However, it can't be with an attitude that says, that everybody else should just drop dead. And if you didn't make it, that's just the cost of business and you didn't make it. That's not a Torah attitude. It's the attitude. And how that expresses itself in values is it has to express itself that you care about those who are weak. Now, you can have debates about what's the best way to get people out of poverty. You can have debates. Is upping the minimum wage a good thing or a bad thing? Bigadol. Does it depress jobs? Does it end up killing more businesses? And therefore, in the long run, in the aggregate, it hurts people more than it helps. That's a legitimate policy debate. As long as the values are values of, number one, we want to sustain those who have not done as well. And number two, we want to make sure, and number two, after we sustain them, we also want to give them a potential to reconnect and build their, to build their wealth. We have to be able to give them a path. So I think the values are what count. If you express a notion that I don't care about the poor, I don't care about the people who aren't successful, or you express the notion that somebody is not entitled to make, $50 billion, I think both of those are not Torah perspectives. Within that, I think you can have a legitimate policy debates, how we, on the one hand, allow for private property, and we allow for the growth of wealth, and we allow for people to be successful and competition, and at the same time, taking care of those who are most unfortunate and not taking the attitude that we don't care about them.
Well, so you don't think disparity of wealth is a moral problem for the Torah? Like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, like being a billionaire is not a problem?
I don't think per se the Torah says anything explicit about it. I think the Torah thinks that wealth has challenges to it. Meaning the Torah says, pen yarum levavcha, your heart, might get very haughty, and you'll forget God, and you'll think kochi v'otzem. There are dangers of wealth that you'll become very haughty, but that can also happen when you don't have wealth, but you have power. Look at politicians. Politicians can get very haughty and think that they're above the law, even if they're not so wealthy, because they have power. Meaning that's a side issue. You could be someone very wealthy and have a good sense of yourself and not be, I've sat next to people who, earn, gazillions of dollars, and you wouldn't know it in the way that they carry themselves, the way they raise their children, the attitude they have to people in shul is one that doesn't bespeak, I'm above you. They don't carry themselves when it comes to communal matters that because I have money, my word is more important than somebody else.
Okay, just one last question. Beautiful. One last question. I'm sorry to cut you off because we only have a minute or two left here. So in Mikra Min's the last words of Moses, if I recall, what's that?
I have it right here next
there it
in
is.
Hebrew.
Okay. Very good. So if I recall, it's not a new argument, but if I recall, unless I'm conflating with someone else I read, Devarim is a little bit of a tikkun on the rest of the Torah, in that it's kind of resetting our priorities. You might have thought up to this point that we are a ritual people, but actually, just as the prophets may emphasize later, actually there's a little bit of a tikkun that we really are seriously about ethics much more than the ritual. And I wonder, do you see this as a tikkun? Is this a new agenda, or is this, or do you see this as just infusing ritual with a deeper moral layer?
Yeah, I don't know. To me, it's a little bit of semantic. I agree. I think that the book of Devarim sheds new light on previous things, but that's in many of the areas, both ritual and ethical. The book of Devarim adds new dimensions to things, and I think they're complementary. They're not contradictory. I think that they're just like the Shemitah. The Shemitah has it has a social justice perspective. It has a purely religious perspective of remembering that God created the world. It has, it takes care of the poor. It takes care of the land. There's many different things that can be true at the same time. So I wouldn't necessarily use the language of tikkun as much as, teasing out things that are inherent there. And that's why I liked Rav Tzadok's image of Torah Sheba'al Peh, that it kind of brings forth things that are already inherent in the law, or that were pregnant in the law at Sinai.
Beautiful. Yasher Koach. Thank you so much, Rav Nati. This was brilliant and thought-provoking and so important for us. Friends, please join us for our next podcast with Rabbi Dr. Yitz Greenberg, who's going to talk about his new book, The Triumph of Life, and how the Orthodox social justice movement can grapple with the notion of life affirmation as the central principle of Torah. Rav Nati, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us.
Okay.